Szanowni Państwo, witamy bardzo serdecznie. Czas na część sektora 3.0, która przeniesie nas w przyszłość. W trakcie festiwalu zadajemy dużo ważnych pytań, które będą także wybiegały w to, co przed nami. O różnych aspektach edukacji, przyszłości, myślenia o tej przyszłości będziemy rozmawiać m.in. z naszą gościnią. Teraz przed Państwem prezentacja Loes Damhof. Hello and please take it away with the presentation.
Thank you, Philippe. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this presentation. My name is Loes Damhof. I am part of the UNESCO Chair on Futures Literacy in Higher Education. And in about 20 minutes, I will take you through a presentation that starts off by explaining a little bit what this capability of future literacy is and the importance of it to education in general. So please stay with me. And I'd like to start with a quote of a book that I love. And the quote is, "All that you touch, you change. All that you change, changes you. The only lasting truth is change." And for those of you who like sci-fi novels, you might recognize this as a quote from the book, The Parable of the Sower, which was published in the 70s, but is about a dystopian Los Angeles in 2025. And after the world is with the effects of climate change, it is war-ridden, it's polarized, it's a dystopian world. And this is a story of a girl that starts a new religion, but it's not based on any god, but it's based on the concept of worshiping change. So instead of worshiping a god or a deity, she worships change and builds this community around it. And that really got me thinking about the idea that change is always all around us constantly. And sometimes the way we look at it, especially in education, that's where I work, we look at change as something that somehow we can initiate or create or do. And sometimes we can. But at the same time, if you embrace the idea that change is happening all the time anyway, maybe it's a good idea to look at how we relate to change, what our relationship is to change. So I just wanted to start off with that. So like I said, Futures Literacy in Higher Education is the name of our UNESCO chair. And for the past 4 years, we've been focusing on future literacy workshops in higher education and beyond, design principles. And for the next 4 years, we're going to look a little bit into the relationship with complexity, and there are different ways to imagine and work with futures, and what kind of research methodologies would really support that the best. The UNESCO chairs are several around the world that work with futures and foresight and future literacy, and this one specifically focuses on higher education. So what is futures literacy? First of all, it's a capability, a skill, a competency that uses futures to rethink the present or to look at the present anew. And when I say using futures, that's literally what it is. We're using future images not to create an image where we want to go per se, but we're using futures to contract data, information on how we think and how we behave in the present. And by expanding our imagination, so we're using more and more futures, we get more information and data and more insight and awareness of the present and how we think, act, and are in the present. So that's what this capability is. So it's very much about the present instead of the future. We're using futures, but that's about it. But I'll give you some more examples. First of all, it's important to understand that the future is uncertain and unknown, and for the simple reason that it does not exist. It's fiction. The future is the later than now, the undefined later than now. And that means that whenever we think about the future, we imagine something, we assume something, we anticipate. And that's really important to understand. But we often talk about the future, first of all, like there is only one, but also like something that that's already there, which is waiting for it to happen or to come towards us. But that's not true. Every future image only exists in our imagination. And in a world that is changing all the time, it might be good to look at how we use futures. Now, there are a lot of ways to think about futures and use futures and for many different purposes. We call it like a big tent. And maybe you've heard of scenario planning before, or forecasting, or foresight. And future literacy is a capability that fits within that big tent of many ways to look at futures. But this is a little bit of a different addition to this big field or discipline of futures, because first of all, because it's a clear capability, but also because it introduces a new way of using the future. And I'll talk a little bit about that. What all these ways of using futures have in common is that they are all based on anticipation, because we anticipate all the time. But we have very little insight in how we anticipate and how that impacts our behavior and our thinking. So I often say it's not what we do or think today that impacts the future. It's how we look at the future that impacts today. So this anticipation is very important, and it has a lot of impacts in the present, right? So we anticipate all the time. How do we do that? The normal, most common ways we anticipate, or as we say, use the future, is because we want to plan something, because we want to optimize something. We're using the future to plan either our work day or to plan our wedding day, our travels, our work, education, curriculum, lesson plans, etc. We want to create an optimal result, and therefore we start planning accordingly. That's a very normal way to use the future. And here you see me on a picture on a very clear path walking towards the lighthouse in the distance. That's my goal. That's where I want to go. And I see a clear path going there. So I planned my trip accordingly. Another way to use the future is based on contingency plans. So really thinking, what do I think is going to happen? What do I expect? And how can I prepare accordingly? And here you see a picture of me also hiking. I like hiking. And I'm a little bit prepared. I brought a map. I brought good hiking boots, a raincoat, and I was kind of prepared for all kinds of weather. Now, this particular snowstorm, I did not entirely anticipate, but I was prepared for contingencies in the weather. Yeah? So this is also a way we often use the future, whether we expect or are prepared for another pandemic, technology changes. This is a very common way to use the future. So we either plan for the future with a certain goal in mind, or we prepare for the future with a certain expectation in mind. It can be positive or negative, but that's how we often are used to using the future. That's what is a normal way to anticipate for us. But as we know now, the pandemic and the effects of climate change upon us, war, the fast developments in AI and technology, we cannot plan or prepare ourselves for everything. Unexpected things happen. Yeah? So just only using the future for planning and preparation is too limited. So we need something else because unexpected events arise. So how do we do this? How do we make sure that we can use the future, anticipate unexpected events without knowing what will happen? We can do that by exploring more and more futures, by stretching our imagination. And by exploring multiple futures, we're stretching the boundaries of our imagination. We become more lenient. We promote a mental leniency almost. And that can help us to see novelty in the present. And if we focus a little bit less on only planning and preparation, but embrace unexpected uncertainty into our thinking, then we are already getting better in navigating futures and using futures. So this idea of exploring multiple futures, maybe different scenarios, unlikely scenarios, plausible, implausible, impossible scenarios, that can really help us to see different things in the present. Now, how does that work? Excuse me. It works by accepting that all futures are based on assumptions. So whether we use futures for planning, preparation, or we're exploring different kinds of futures, every time we think about the future, we make an assumption about continuity and discontinuity. That's just what we do, for the simple reason that the future does not exist. So, and those assumptions can be very, very useful. Assuming that your appointments will show up on a workday, assuming your house will still be there next week, or assuming certain career choices, your job might still be there. So we make a lot of assumptions about the future, and that can be very useful. But sometimes our assumptions can keep us limited and make us more path dependent, or they limit us in our creativity. Then it might be helpful to maybe let go of those assumptions. But it always starts with becoming aware of the fact that we have them. When we think about the future, we assume something. Now, these are called anticipatory assumptions. And I just want to give you a couple of examples of what I'm talking about. For example, it is going to rain. That's a prediction of the future. And if I want to go out tomorrow, I'm starting to prepare. I might be planning. I'm taking an umbrella. This is a prediction also based on assumption. First of all, based on science, because I've seen it maybe on my weather app on my telephone, or I've seen it in the weather forecast. So I'm assuming this information is probably correct. I also base it on previous experiences, so on the past, because very often the weather forecast has been correct. So I'm basing my plans and thoughts and behavior on those assumptions. But sometimes we make assumptions that have a little bit of a different. They're just a little bit different in character. For example, education will become entirely personalized and still in the future. Now, that is also a projection of the future, but it's not based on previous experiences. It's maybe more based on a desire to innovate, or maybe based on the realization that pandemic can cause us to stay at home. So this is sometimes a projection that's based on assumptions about the future that are a little bit less certain. We just don't know whether that will be the case. It can also be based on a political agenda from companies. So that's really important to understand. These two are different ways of using the future. The first one is based on clear precedent and past experiences and data. And the second one is maybe a little bit more based on the desire to innovate, desire to go into a certain direction. But both futures do not exist. So it's interesting to think about what is lying underneath those predictions. And the last one example is from the quote in the beginning: change is the only certainty. That is also a way to look at the future. But this is a lot more open. If we accept this future image or this assumption about the future, that has a profound impact on how we show up. If we embrace the idea that everything is changing constantly, that has different consequences. Now, what does this mean to become aware of these assumptions? If we become aware of them, and we can through exploring multiple futures, that means that we can become more open to new things in the present, to new ways of doing. Now, this is important, especially for education, because higher education designs by the idea that what needs to be learned is knowable in advance. But of course, we know that's not always the case, because things change, unexpected events occur, phenomena occur. So how do we respond to that? So in a lot of educational programs are designed with the aim to eliminate uncertainty, to make sure that students are ready for the future. But is that enough? It isn't, right? You cannot just teach students to be ready for the future or to embrace uncertainty if your programs do not have an element of uncertainty in them itself. So for what I've learned over the past few years is that if you want to apply this and embrace this level of element of uncertainty, complexity into your study programs, you need to look at educational institutions as a holistic, from a holistic approach. And we can look at them saying, hey, do they incorporate this uncertainty and emergence in the institutions, in their decision making as well? And can we incorporate or implement this kind of mindset in the curriculum instead of just seeing it as a course? Because just designing a course and embracing uncertainty is not enough. And how do we challenge the status quo? If we believe that our systems are not equipped for these uncertain and complex times, then what can we do to change that? Yeah? How can we challenge the status quo in higher education? Now, of course, when I talk about complexity, these times often feel that they are more complex than they are used to. That's not really, I mean, times have always been complex and times are always uncertain. But we can have a critical look at how we are designing our educational programs towards complexity and make a distinction between complicated and complexity, and simple problems and challenges, complicated ones and complex. Now, a simple one has a very clear output. For example, making coffee. I want coffee. I don't have it. How do I make it? It's a simple one with clear instructions. Things get a little bit more complicated, like rocket science, that still have a certain path, steps, but it's more difficult. But the outcome is defined. But if we are approaching complex challenges, like climate change, migration, polarization, the technical developments, challenges that are very complex with no clear outcome defined, we need a different approach to learning. If the outcome cannot be defined, how do we organize our curriculum that helps our students to deal with that, to appreciate that complexity, to be ready for it? And that might take some time to do that. Okay. So the challenge for learning in that complex world and complex challenges is that we also need to change how we view learning and education. And instead of a transfer from knowledge from teacher to students, we need to talk more about becoming, more of a personal development, and talk about collective and individual learning. Engaged learning, formal and informal, and understand that students, they need to learn how to navigate and be and become in complex environments. And just transferring knowledge from one person to another will not do the trick. Now, to tackle this particular challenge, futures literacy is a really good skill to be able to do that. Because the learning objectives, as we've been studying at our chair, is that by becoming futures literate, so by becoming skilled in using multiple futures, by expanding our imagination, we can see more in the present. We observe more novelty. We enhance our perception. And we learn how to embrace complexity. We see new paths emerge. We can let go of fixed scenarios. We can appreciate uncertainty. And that another learning outcome is to the development of a new sense of agency. So not just think that, hey, I can create change or I need to initiate change, but also observe change. Because if everything is changing all the way anyway, then the art of observing change, seeing change, taking advantage of change also becomes a very important skill. So these different skills are what we call the future literacy, the essential capability of the 21st century, as proclaimed by UNESCO, because it can open our minds to appreciate and embrace complexity of global societal challenges, to be more open in the present. It also helps us to realize that anticipation really, really matters. Yeah? And imagining multiple futures and becoming aware of how and why we anticipate changes how we think, act, and be in the present. And that can help us with challenging the status quo. It can help us deal with complexity, and it can help us look for different ways to learn. Now, another takeaway is that we plan and prepare. That's how we often use the future, to eliminate uncertainty. And by exploring alternative futures, that can help us to be open for novelty and emergence. And that is really important, because if we embrace the idea that everything is changing, the world is complex, and the future is uncertain, we really need to rethink our educational programs and our educational systems. And we need to move from transfer of knowledge to more of a becoming. And learning should take place in complex environments and offer students the skills and professionals how to do that. And the last one, which is very important, future literacy empowers. And I've seen that in the many, many workshops and laboratories that I've organized so far. Imagining another future besides a dominant narrative is an act of hope. If we are too focused on one particular scenario or become too attached to one particular future, often dictated by companies, by governments, by Hollywood, by books and films, etc. So what is a dominant narrative? It's important to ask the question, to teach students to ask the question, whose future is this? And just teaching students to imagine something else, just for the sake of exploration, that in itself is an act of hope. And that in itself causes us to think and act a little bit differently. And that awareness, that understanding that the world is not static, it's not a status quo, it's not just it's just a narrative, it's just fiction, and you can engage with that in that conversation, that is hopeful and very necessary for the times to come. And with that, I think my 2 minutes are done, and I'd like to close my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Loes. Really a head opener, I think, your presentation. Thank you for that. And I had a list of questions, and now I have even more questions. So we have to get on with our talk right now, so we can have at least some of the answers. What I'm thinking about when I'm thinking about the future is something pretty abstract, and I'm keen to say that most people find the future pretty abstract, and I would like to ask you, what is the key, and I have one proposition to thinking about the future or making it the tool for today. Is it imagination? Because I think that this is something that not everyone has in big amounts. So maybe the imagination is kind of a key to thinking about the future.
Well, it's the only way to think about the future, right? So when we think about the future, we imagine something. And yes, it feels very abstract. First of all, we talk about the future, and that's not, it is futures, right? Because my future is different than yours, and my imagine of future is different than yours. So that's already to start thinking in a plurality of futures might help. And what also makes it abstract is that we do not share our images of the future. But if you and I would talk about the next 20 minutes or talk about tomorrow, we're already talking about the future. Yeah. So it's very, I think it's important for people to realize that it may seem abstract because because of the limited way we think about it, but also the limited way we talk about it. Very, very few times we share with each other what our images are. You'd be surprised if you just talk to your neighbor about how do you see the future of this street, or how do you see the future of this community, what people come up with. And that in itself expands your imagination. So you don't have to go through very fancy, high over cognitive heavy exercises to stretch your imagination. Or ask yourself the question, what if the sun will not come up tomorrow? I mean, that's maybe not a good example, but just something, what would happen if I would just take the train and just without any endpoint in mind? Or what would happen if just by asking yourself what if questions, just for the sake of exploration, you're already engaging with future images. So it feels abstract, but the key is to be comfortable with uncertainty. And by doing that, it's important to maybe imagine different futures yourself, but also share them. It's an individual and a collective process to share that with each other. That's very important.
The what if question, I think, is very important also in creating stories, because that's how stories happen when we think about movies or books. Or anything that involves imagination and things not happening in the real world, for example. It almost every time begins with what if. So thank you for that, and it's worth noting. The future can be the tool for today, but we have to manage certain things. When we have to manage our expectations, we can manage something for tomorrow. So managing, is it also like a tool that we can use, thinking about the futures, the possibilities?
I'm not sure if yeah, of course. I mean, that's often what we do. I'm not sure if you mean by managing. I think that's like speaks to the planning and preparation I was talking about, right? So, yeah, we're if you're trying to influence. So of course, whatever you decide today kind of has an impact on the next course of events, right? So that changes. And but people say, oh, that changes the future, or we can manage the future. You can't. You can only manage your images of the future. You can only talk about that, envision that, let go, invent new ones, etc. No one can manage, create, shape, or anything the future, because it was never there. So if you do something different today, you're not changing a course of events. That course of events was never there because it doesn't exist. But what we can do if we imagine a desirable future or something that we really like to do, of course you can, backcast to the present and think, hey, what can I do now that could maybe set that in motion? Yeah, you can do that. And at the same time, knowing it will never turn out the way you imagine. So the managing is very limited in itself because there's so many unexpected events. But it does, understanding that futures impact our decision-making process, that is a very powerful awareness. And that can help you make different decisions in management. Yeah, for sure. But it's always limited because we are not capable of controlling or managing everything. And neither we shouldn't be sorry about that. I think uncertainty, complexity is a beautiful thing, and we should appreciate it, not try to manage it.
Right. I was more talking about managing our expectations, because when we expect something to happen in a certain way, it can turn out, and it surely does most of the time, it can turn out into something completely different. How can we find a sense? Yeah, please.
Well, yeah, manage our expectations. Yeah, but this is what I'm talking about: appreciating uncertainty. If we become so path dependent, we call this. So you're setting a goal, you're planning something using the future, and you expect something, and of course, disappointments happen all the time. And then COVID was not a disappointment, it was a shock. But what COVID did, all it did was tell us something about our assumptions about continuity and discontinuity. Things that we assume would continue or assume would never happen or maybe happen in the future, all of a sudden we're here. So whenever something like that happens, it's not about managing expectations. It's about understanding that if you are disappointed or something does not go as planned or prepared or expected, what it does, it's just life, it's just happening, and your assumptions are being challenged. That's it. Life all of a sudden is not taking a different course, or its universe is not telling you so. No, it's just, this is life. It's expectant, spontaneous, emergent, part of it. And we envision, we imagine, and we expect. And your attitude to saying that, hey, this is not how I intended to be, therefore my assumptions about something are being challenged. It helps to keep that in mind. That's basically what it is.
You seem very calm talking about the future, and I think that most people experience some kind of uncertainty, fear, something that is not a positive emotion. But I guess when we come to terms with all the things that you've said, that life just goes on, it can be also a surprise, then we can be calmer.
Yeah, well, I'm calm now, but of course I suffer from anticipatory anxiety at times, of course, and also anticipatory joy. And through this work, I've come to realize how much I rely on my anticipations, how much joy I get from anticipatory joy, looking forward to something or anticipating something, or sometimes I get anxiety. But then I also realized it's just a matter of letting go of control. Is that, I don't know who said this, but you know, the realization that I never had control. All I had was anxiety. And often things always go differently. And that's also a huge comfort. I find it to be a comfort at times. And yeah, the fact that we don't know what's going to happen, I've learned to understand or I learned to appreciate that as well. Is that even if I expect bad things, they can also turn out very differently. It can go both ways. And it's often my attitude or my own ideas or values or norms or convictions or assumptions about something, whether it's good or bad, that I can challenge. When COVID happened, I was so sure that I would never be able to travel, and I thought, how can I do this work if I don't stand in front of groups of students or people, if I can't travel anymore? And then I realized I need to be reframed. I have an assumption about traveling, that traveling is about mobility. But what if I take away that assumption and change it? Then maybe it's not about mobility, but it's about exploration. And can I still explore even if I don't move from A to B? And of course I can. I can explore in my head. I can go anywhere. So I really try to look at it from that perspective. Of course, this is a very limited. There are a lot of other feelings of when the pandemic hit. Of course, absolutely. But that, to me, that was one of the things that I challenged. That I thought, how do I, if I'm really afraid of something, I must be assuming that I must be assuming something. What is it? What is my assumption about this? And can I play with that? And can I turn it around? And then I often see, when I do, I see another future popping up. And that in itself, I find hopeful. Whether it's a hopeful future or not, it's something desirable, a utopia or dystopia. The fact in itself that I can actively imagine something different, I find hopeful. And maybe that's the calm, and also realizing that I think a lot of young people now, they suffer from a sense of trauma or grief about climate change, like anxiety, like really scared, and that's very real. And it's also good to realize that we have used futures, that we had images of the future that were very different. And to let go of those, you also need to be aware that you had them in the first place. So future literacy is not just only a happy-go-lucky, it's a neutral capability. But we can use them to really think, hey, what were our future images that we have to let go of? And me too, that next generations will be wealthier or better, or human rights or democracy or climate change. Or we had these images of a world maybe that are now being challenged. And that's what we have to come to terms with. But understanding and asking ourselves, not the question, how did we get here now, but what made us think we were never going to get here? And that can help us think, oh, we assumed things will get better. We assumed there were certain developments, and that is being challenged now. And that can be maybe to open up that space, can be helpful in dealing with that anxiety and grief. Yeah, grief too. Grief over used futures is a very real thing. Yeah.
Where can we learn more about learning about the future, the futures, everything you told us about? Are there any books, podcasts, maybe something that you can recommend for our viewers if they want to learn more?
Yeah. Yes, there is a very good podcast. It's called Future Pod. It's an Australian podcast, and they've been around for years, and they have many great interviews with a lot of futurists. So maybe it's sometimes a little bit dense, but there's also a lot of more playful, more different voices out there as well. We base the training programs that I give are very much based on the work of Riel Miller. And he wrote a book. It's called Transforming the Future: Anticipation in the 21st Century. But that's pretty academic, so very theoretical. But there are also a lot of case studies in that book that describe how we use the laboratories. There's the website of my chair, futureliteracy.net, where we offer our training programs and the information about that, of course. And there's several. There's so many posts on Medium about futures literacy, about futures thinking. There's the Futures Journal, but again, that's all still very. It's just very academic. So we're still looking for ways, and that's the next step in futures literacy in this kind of work. Is that how do we take all that research, that framework, how do we apply it in a way that everybody can become more aware? Because that I know, it's nobody owns the future, but everybody uses it. And we can all maybe become a little bit more aware of how and why in one context. So I will make sure that I will share some of the links with this platform so we can learn. But yeah, follow me on LinkedIn. I post regularly about all kinds of courses. And there's a lot of, in Germany, there's a great initiative. They develop courses and training programs as well. There's teachthefuture.org with a lot of material for schools and education. Several, of course, there's a UNESCO website with information on all the chairs all over the world. So it really depends on what you're interested in, because futures work has many different ways, with design, decolonization, technology, more foresight. So it's almost too much to mention, and it's still very new. And at the same time, everybody uses the future. You can dream about any future, any topic. So there's a lot to discover for sure.
Sure. Thank you very much. You've certainly opened my head, and I would like to ask you one quick last question. When you talk about many futures, everything that you've talked to us about, what is the feedback? What do people tell you? Do they change their attitudes?
Yes, for not always, but a lot of the training programs and the labs and the workshops that I've done can potentially be transformative. And for some, it definitely has. It has transformed my life and my thinking and my being and how I show up in the world, for sure. And what we also see is that because it is such a fundamental way of perceiving the world, of seeing the world, of thinking about something so fundamental, the future, is that just being in a one-time workshop or listening to a lecture or in a presentation like this is not enough. Like with every capability, it takes time to nurture and develop. So that's really important to understand. So that I see, and we have me, my chair, but a lot of other initiatives around the globe, really trying to invest in the community and invest in the nurturing the capability, not just a one-time workshop, but really seeing what are opportunities to think like this, to play with emergence, to play with uncertainty. So yeah, but it's been what people mostly say. It was transformative. It was eye-opening. It was fantastic. But then I feel like I'm on an expedition into the jungle. But then I go back into the world of concrete. And how do I use these tools and these ways of thinking in my own context, where everything is about planning and preparation? So if you're an educator, you're in my courses, you're introduced to this way of thinking, but then you have to go back into a system that is not about exploring futures or imagination, but it is about planning and preparation, managing. Then sometimes it can be a little bit difficult. So that's the next challenge. How do we keep that openness? How do we continue to create spaces where we can explore multiple futures and practice that, the capability and therefore the act of hope?
Thank you very much. We have to hope that this talk and your presentation were a little spark that can change someone's attitude. And with that, I thank you very much for all your knowledge, all your words, and the presentation. And I hope that it truly will change someone's thinking. Loes Damhof, thank you very much.
Thank you.
A teraz, szanowni państwo, zapraszamy na kolejne części festiwalu Sektor 3.0, który trwa w najlepsze. Proszę korzystać do woli i Cóż, do zobaczenia.